Okay, so what kind of a language we use in abstract, you have talked about it. But if we talk about the introduction, how can we write an introduction in a research paper?
I mean, this is the important part, and this is the main part. I mean, this is a part where you sell your idea. Okay. This is the part where you introduce your topic to your audience. I mean, that's why we call the introduction is a why part of a research. Okay. I mean, why? At first place, why the readers should read your paper. Why you are going to conduct this research. I mean, introduction, primarily speaking, is the logic of the research. It answers the why question. And when we talk about this part, we can say that, I mean, primarily speaking, this part addresses three questions. The researcher describes his or her research problem, then explains what does that mean, and then introduces. So these are the three parts. So what does it mean? The topic of the paper, the purpose of the research, and what kind of contribution that research is going to make. This is an introduction, and this is the most important part of any paper. Either it's a research report, either it's a research project, either it's a research thesis, or either we are going to submit a paper to a research journal for publication. Because this is the part where we hook the attention of our listeners. I mean, not listeners, actually readers. I mean, why the scientific community should pay attention to this paper. This is the part. If this part is well written, it's logical, it has consistency between the different parts and the arguments, then, I mean, the reader, once start reading your paper, will go through at the end of the paper. So we can say that primarily, or generally speaking, introduction contextualizes the research topic, and it describes the research topic, it explains the research topic, the different debates about that research topic. So when we talk in more specific terms, we can say that 6 questions are important when we are writing a research introduction. So what they are, what is the research topic? I mean, what is the problem? Introduction starts with a problem. Because like abstract started with the introduction of the problem, the first sentence. The first sentence of an introduction is what is the problem, and then why there is need to investigate that problem. In other words, we can say what is the impact of that problem. I mean, if I have a problem or you have a problem to investigate, but the impact of that problem is not very significant, I think it's hard to justify the logic to conduct research on that topic. I mean, that's important point to remember. So what does it mean why there is a need to conduct a research on a topic? It means that how many people are influenced by that problem. I mean, what is the impact of that problem on individuals, organizations, and society? Or even we can go, I mean, the aperture can be much bigger than, I mean, maybe even can on the country, particular country, if the topic is too big and too broad. And then, of course, the third question is, what has been found about that topic by the previous scholars? I mean, this is important point now. What we do, we try to find, or we try to write what already has been written or found by the previous scholars about that topic. And this is the important point, because this will help to establish a topic. We want to establish here that this topic has been extensively explored, because this is important problem. It has impact on organizations, individuals, and even society. So different scholars has explored different aspects of this topic. We bring them here. And then the next 4th point is, I mean, what are the gaps or deficiency in the previous literature, loopholes or gaps? I mean, if everything has been said about this topic, if everything already has been explored about this topic, there's no need to conduct a research on that topic. You know, that's the important point. Because if there are no gaps, there are no loopholes, there are no deficiencies in the existing literature. So what does it mean? It means there is no need to conduct a research on this topic. Stop here. And on the other hand, if there are gaps or if there are deficiencies in the existing literature, different aspects of that phenomena which we are going to investigate, then, you know, the important point is, once we identify the gaps, these gaps will be our contribution.
Okay.
Once we identified that this gap exists in the existing literature, then we say the present research or the current study will address this gap in the literature. And in other words, this is the contribution of my study. And then the last sentence of this part of justification introduction part is who will get benefit of this literature which you are going to contribute. Either if it's a theoretical paper, either the scientific community is going to get benefit out of it. If it's an applied research, what we talk about in our last interview or show, then of course different individuals or organizations can get benefit out of it. So introduction, the conclusion of introduction, the concluding lines of the introductions talk about contribution of the research and then who will get benefit out of that contribution. So as a review, we can say there's 6 parts. First is what is the problem? Second part in introduction, what we need. Actually, these 6 questions must be answered by the researcher in an introduction. If I want my introduction to be logical, to be argumentative, I need to answer these 6 questions. What they are, I repeat them again. What is the topic? What is the impact of that topic? What has already been investigated about that topic, or what has been published or written about that topic? And then what are the gaps and deficiencies? And these gaps and deficiency, I'm going to address them. This is my contribution. And then the last part and the 6th part is who will get benefit out of that contribution. I mean, individuals, scientific community, if it's a theoretical paper, and talk about some theories or some methodologies, then of course scientific community is the main consumer of that paper. I mean, the professors and researchers will read that paper. If it's a applied research, then of course different organizations or individuals will get benefit out of it. And of course, if it's addressing a theoretical question, important theoretical question in a field, or an important applied problem in a society, of course, then society as a whole is also the consumer of that research. So that is how introductions set the stage of a research.
Okay.
It introduces your topic. It actually convinces the readers why they should read my introduction or your introduction or our introduction. That's why we call it that an introduction in a research project answers why question. You know, we in research, I mean, like in the last lecture, we talk about exploratory research, then descriptive, then predictive, and then explanatory, who started from what, how, and why question. Research paper or project writing follows a reverse order. It starts from why, then how, and then at the end, it addresses what question, what we have found. So this is how we write an introduction.
Okay. In the start, you have talked about abstract. Then it comes to introduction. Does the language change in abstract or in introduction?
Of course, because because English is a second language. I mean, and most of us, of course, including you and me, maybe are not very fluent in English writing or not very expert in English writing. Of course, most of the people are, but the early beginner researchers, I mean, face problems while writing these different parts, that what kind of language they should use in different parts of a research project, of a research thesis or a paper. So when we talk about introduction, actually introduction, once again, when we describe our topic, I mean, our problem or topic, then we use the present tense.
Okay.
And of course, whatever we use, that must followed by proper references. I mean, what kind of referencing style we follow? It must have a proper in-text citation. I mean, in-text citation means the references which we give in the text, and then of course at the end proper referencing. I mean, because in research papers and research projects we don't write bibliography, we write references. There is a difference between bibliography and references. We will talk when we go to that section. So in the references section, in text citation, whatever has been cited must be properly cited at the end in the reference section, because most of the paper are rejected because they don't follow proper referencing style or pattern or format. And then the second part, when we talk about the previous studies, what have already been found, we can say that Mr. A has found, or Mr. A found, while conducting this research. We use past tense when we talk about the previous studies in the introduction, because the part where we want to establish the logic and actually we want to identify the gap, we use the past tense there, and usually when we talk about the previous work or the experiments or the studies which already have been conducted. And then, when we discuss the previous studies and then we introduce our topic, when we talk about the gap, and we say, however, this particular aspect has been overlooked or has not been extensively investigated. Therefore, this current study or this study focuses on, investigates or examines. So we use the present tense. Mostly in the quantitative papers we use the researcher, we use the third person. The researchers or the researcher uses or addresses or investigates. But now, some journals even accept the first person. If there is one author, he or she can write, I use or I bridge this gap, or I investigate this phenomenon to add to the existing literature to solve this problem or this one or that one. So we use active voice when we want to introduce after using past tense, reviewing the past studies to identify the gaps. Once the gap is identified and I want to introduce my study, that this study will address this particular gap which has been overlooked in the previous studies, I use the present active tense. Sometimes passive voice is also preferable in some cases in introduction, but it depends. Because when we use passive voice, it's too silent. So it's more, when we use active voice, it gives more energy. It gives more energy, it gives more authority in writing. So I think it's better, but it depends on the context. So these are the three parts. The first part, use the present tense, where we introduce our topic, where we establish the logic. The second part, where we review what has already been found about this topic in the previous literature, we use the past tense. And then the last part, where I introduce my study, where I say that what will be the contribution of my study. Once again, we use the present active tense. Sometimes maybe passive, but most of the time, generally speaking, we use the present active tense.
Okay. So after talking about language, let's talk about the next steps. After introduction, what step should come in a research?
Actually, as we have already talked in the beginning, because introduction is the first part. That's the most important part, where the researcher introduces the research topic. Now, most of the times, it depends on the format. Some journals accept it, some don't it, some want it, some don't want it. Most of the time, introduction is followed. The first part of an introduction is about the justification of a research, why we want to conduct that research. And then the second part of the introduction is, of course, about the literature. Okay. What does that mean? It means it talks about the variables. It talks about the methods. It talks about the theories. It talks about the variables. Because after the literature review, most of the early beginner students confuse with introduction and literature review.
Okay.
Let me make this point very clear. Okay. Introduction differs from the literature review. If you ask an early beginner researcher students, how introduction and literature review are different, they will say that in literature review, we use the references. In introduction, we don't use the references. Actually, this is not the logical point. Okay. Introduction is also reference-based, because it's the most logical part of my research or your research or our research. But the important point, what we need to differentiate or what we need to remember is that the references which we use in an introduction part of a paper are different from the references which we use in literature review part of our paper. How they differ? Because the references which we use in our introduction part of the paper, they are, generally speaking, or primarily, they are concerned with the logical or justification of my research. Okay. Here I use the references to justify that this particular phenomena has been investigated by different scholars and different dimensions of this problem has already been investigated. So here I'm going to establish the logic of my paper, why I want to conduct this study. While the references which come in the literature review, they are about conceptualization and operationalization of my paper. I operationalize my variables. In my research project, the same example once again, violent movies and their impact on aggressive behavior. So what variables different researchers have used? to investigate this relationship between these two variables, how these two variables vary, or I mean we call them, I mean these kind of variables we call them covariant, how they vary together. So here the references are about the variables. I mean first part of a literature review, either it's a independent part or either it's a subheading of an introduction. You know, some papers just write introduction, the first part is introduction, and then they don't give any heading, and then they switch to literature review. And you know, the experts in a field know very well that where the introduction ended and from where the literature review started. But it's maybe the problem for the early researchers. So the first part, I think the first part, I mean literature review, either it's we were talking that either it's an independent part or either it's a sub part of an introduction, has three parts. It has an exploratory part, it has a descriptive part, and it has an explanatory part. Or what we call it has a descriptive part where we describe our variables, it has a relational part where we correlate our variables, and then it of course has an explanatory part where we identify the gaps and we pose our own questions or hypotheses. Okay. So I mean maybe the time is running short, so I mean if it is so, we may talk about the literature review in detail in the next lecture.